Hello, and thank you for joining us for CBM Calling. We're glad that you did. If you're like me, you've probably spent the last few weeks feeling upset and disturbed, probably angry over the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. If you watched our show last Friday, you would have heard a conversation that we held with two of our Baptist friends from the US discussing the current state of race relations. However, as we stated on that show, racism is not an American problem. Yes, racism is an everyday reality for many Canadians, particularly for people from the Black and Indigenous communities. And I think it's probably time that we need to burst the bubble that we all live in, that we do not have a race problem in our country. It's time for us to speak openly and honestly as people of faith who are working together toward change. So we invited three trusted friends and colleagues from within the Canadian Baptist family to discuss racism and to share their own experiences. Yesterday, we held this conversation. It was very meaningful. And due to the length, we are going to air part one of that conversation today and part two of it next week, next Wednesday. I know that these conversations are hard to hear. They are often uncomfortable. They make us feel bad. They may make us feel guilty. And if you have heard this introduction and you are still willing to stick it through with me and to listen and to learn and to talk about this together with us, I want to say thank you. You are already being part of the change that needs to happen by having an open mind and an open heart. When one part of the body of Christ suffers, we all suffer. And my deepest hope is that we will work together toward ending that suffering as co-workers in God's kingdom. So here now is part one of my conversation with three courageous people for whom I have the deepest respect. Cheryl Bear, CBM's Indigenous Relations Specialist. Doss Sidney, who is the pastor of Highland Baptist Church in Kitchener. And David McCleary, who is the English pastor from East Toronto Chinese Baptist Church. Thank you for joining us, and I'll see you after part one of our conversation.
Thank you all so much for joining me today. I know that our conversation today is not on the happiest topics. Usually when we do talk, it's on much lighter subjects, but I think it's important, the conversation that we're going to have today. And I think we want to acknowledge that these are not easy conversations to have. They are sometimes very uncomfortable, and they're uncomfortable to listen to, probably, for some of the people that are going to be watching this. So I think we just want to acknowledge that, and we want to say thank you to those people for being open to joining us for this conversation today. So maybe I can just start with asking all of you what this past few weeks has been like for you. It has been an incredibly tumultuous time, particularly for the African American community, but certainly all the things that have happened around the last few weeks. In particular, I think we need to name George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery. We need to name them and what has happened to them and their lost lives. But particularly in their deaths, I think it's opened up a lot of conversation here in our own country about racism. And I think it's kind of burst a little bit of a bubble. I know, Cheryl, we've talked about this before. For people who've held this illusion that, Canada is not as racist as the United States, and you have always said to me, like, those people have no idea. I'm just wondering, Cheryl, do you think that people still think that after, these past few weeks?
Yes, I do. Unfortunately, we just heard prominent politician from Ontario say that there is no systemic racism in Canada. Those words came from the mouth of one of the most well-known politicians in our country, and that should have surprised me. It should have angered me. It should have shocked me. But none of those things happened. I was just like, yeah, that's how he feels. That's how a lot of Canadians feel. Still, and I called it a willing blindness. Just willing to exist in the two realities that exist in Canada. There's one reality for non-Indigenous people, and usually, and then there's another reality for people of color, Indigenous people, and that's been consistent. That's been the consistent experience for especially Indigenous people in the history of Canada, for sure.
Mm. I think that's actually really hard for a lot of people to accept. I know people who are friends of mine, people who are probably my colleagues, people who are white. I think that's probably really hard for them to hear, because I think our experience of racism, they would like to think was maybe a long time ago, or that maybe things have changed a lot in recent years. And I think it's really hard for them to feel like us, people who are their friends, people they work with, people they care about, hopefully, that we experience these things still day to day, particular Indigenous communities, Black communities, but certainly any people that are people of color, for sure. I'm wondering, Dave, I need to say first, though, that actually Doss highlighted something for me when we were emailing just a few days ago. And it was something that you had written, Doss, I think, for the local newspaper, but around the Black Lives Matter movement, that people are coming back and saying, well, all lives matter. I'm wondering, Dave, if you can just speak to why it is so important that we acknowledge that Black Lives Matter right now at this time and in this place.
Mm. That is a tough one. I mean, yes, I think it's important to say that in this moment of acute pain, in this moment of loss, of grief, of sadness, of, just like, it's just a horrible moment in the history of humanity. To say that this community in particular is suffering, and to say, well, all lives matter, dismisses the reality of that pain and makes it unimportant. All lives matter, certainly. That's true. We are all made in the image of God. That is something that is foundational to who we are as the people of God. Jesus was sent here. He came to die for everybody so that we can be reconciled to God and to each other. But we're also told that when a part of the body suffers, we all suffer. That if we are all made in the image of God, then we're all family, and we should take the suffering of that family seriously, and we should, if we're in right relationship with them, we should enter into that pain, to share that load, to share that burden, to share, just to be sharers, co-human with them, sharing what's going on, and just saying, well, I matter too. Yes, you do matter as well. However, at this moment, when somebody's being killed in the street, we need to take the pain of that community seriously. We need to take their suffering seriously. We need to be an evidence-based people, and to say, based on what I'm seeing, their pain, their acute pain, this point of pain that everybody bore witness to, needs to be addressed. And we need to take, those 500 years of contact, and that those years of struggle, we need to take that seriously, and we need to come to grips with it. And so we have to acknowledge that there's a system, there's a society, there's structures, there are things in place that are disproportionately weighted, and they're uneven and unfair in the way that they're set up, and that they have consequences, right? It's the immigrant, or brown person, Black person, Indigenous person that is not white, This is the calculus. You work twice as hard for half as much, right? That is also part of the pain, right? And the fact that because things are not even, that what we work for is then precarious, right? Not assured, right? That your hard work, that your effort is going to, that all of that's not going to be taken away because of on a whim, right? So there's so many different levels of pain and suffering that that these incidents are suddenly opening our eyes to. That you're not even safe sleeping in your own house. That that you know, that those that are there to serve and protect also get to be judge, jury, and executioner, and it's been that way for years and years and years, you know, and that's hard for me to say because I have family that's in law enforcement, right, as well, that are presently in law enforcement, and so there's the double bind of being Black and blue. So it's all complicated, but that's life. That's family life, relationships. They're always complicated, and we have to listen to each other and to work out how to be together and be together properly, rightly. You know.
And the Black Lives Matter movement is really highlighting a particular problem. It is not to say, it is not judging the value of all life necessarily, or that, you know, that of course all of our lives have value as God's children, as you highlighted, Dave. But Doss, I wonder if you can reiterate what you had said about Black Lives Matter in the statement that you had written, just why it's important to say that right now Black Lives Matter, and not to say, well, all lives matter.
Sure. Yeah, I've had people say that to me. Well, you know, all lives matter, as if they were disclosing something that was of much greater magnitude and largesse, you know, bigness of heart. My love embraces all kinds of people. But you know, for the last 400 years or 500 years, it's Black people who have been brutalized and continue to be brutalized. And when we say Black Lives Matter, we're not saying they matter to the exclusion of other people. We're saying they matter too. And when you think of the history of the Black Lives Matter, it happened soon after Trayvon Martin, that young teenager, was shot by George Zimmerman. And here were three women who said, this cannot continue. We don't have open season on Black people, on Black lives. Their lives matter too. And it's important to recognize that context out of which it has come. And it's an important one. And it is so valuable. I was looking at my news feed today, and there was something from Innisfail in about 115 kilometers north of Calgary. And there was a woman there who wanted to have a Black Lives Matter march. And there was a lot of blowback from the town. And someone said, when will we have a White Lives Matter protest? And they just don't get it. It's not as if they are being brutalized. They are people who have tremendous privilege. And it is Black people's lives whose plight, whose situation need to be brought to the fore. And it was Miroslav Volf, you know, who actually raised that point beautifully when he said, at this point in time, it is Black lives that are at risk. And we need to be aware of that and support it, support the movement.
Doss, you use a word that I think is hard for some people to come to terms with, or even to understand, which is privilege. And I feel as though a lot of people don't want to accept that because of the color of the skin that they were born in, they walk around with a certain privilege in the society. Do you you must encounter people who either don't understand it or don't know how to use their privilege in a way that can actually help them to be allies of people of color. I'm wondering if you've had that experience, Doss.
Sure. In fact, I had a discussion this morning with our staff, and one of them was saying, well, among people I know, they're asking the question, does this mean I have to feel guilty for being white? Do I have to feel badly for my position, for my birth? And I'll come to that in a minute, but I want to make one little proviso as well. I'm not a subject matter expert. And my views are not essential in the sense that I speak for everyone, but I come out of my own limited reading and my own life experiences. I know some wonderful white people, and one of them happens to be my wife.
We
who
all
is
know wonderful white people.
wonderful
We
wife.
have to say that first. We all know wonderful white people.
Who is loving and compassionate and thoughtful, and whose care and love is directed to people of whatever race or color. So when I talk about privilege and these kind of terms, I hope people realize that it's not the rule that it applies to everyone. But there are, of course, wonderful people in whatever racial category. I think in Canada, racism is so covert and also deeply ingrained. And people don't realize sometimes what is really happening and what they're engaged in doing. And some people say, well, it happened so long ago. It's a historic reality. It no longer applies in our time. And this matter of privilege, well, you talk about white privilege. In my case, I worked very hard all my life to get to where I am. And my parents or grandparents lived in a little shanty little house, and they had an outhouse 50 yards away from the house. It was a hard life. There was no privilege in that. And they don't understand the areas in which their lives are privileged. And that is really too bad. They don't understand systemic racism. Here are some pieces of information, for example, that come from the US. That the net worth of Black families is about 2% of the average white family. And somehow we assume that those kind of things are just normative and don't really need to be changed. That's how life is. We talk about white privilege, and sometimes I think people are uncomfortable with the term white privilege because suddenly you're identifying some people by race and also saying, well, they're privileged. And some people have opted to use the term unearned privilege. And I don't know if that helps or detracts. Again, you say, well, what advantage do white people have? What is it that, what privilege is theirs? And it was very interesting. I read recently a study that came out of Australia. And there too, of course, are Indigenous people and also Black people. And in this particular study, they followed up on 1,500 people who were getting onto a bus. And some of them were white people and some of them were Black people. And once on the bus, these people were told, well, I don't have the full fare. And what is the outcome? And with regard to the white people, in 72% of the cases, they were told, oh, well, okay, next time. With the Black people, what happened? You can guess. It was 32% of the cases they were told, okay, you can come on. There's an element of compassion that is given to one group of the population that isn't accorded to the other. There's one example of privilege. And in some respects, Black people have to prove, or racialized people have to prove themselves. Others don't. They're accepted as they are. You say, oh, she's Black and she actually does a great job. What a surprise. And there are all kinds of areas where this applies in the legal system, in the educational system. I remember some years ago, I worked as a volunteer in a children's group. I'm past that age now, but there was a time when I would run around with those youngsters. I remember, I mean, it was a mixed crowd of people. And one of the people who was also a volunteer, white man, took me aside and said to me about a white kid who was clearly, high energy and was instigating issues in the crowd. Said to me, well, that guy one day is going to be a leader in our midst.
Mm.
And there was a black kid also in that same category. He pointed it out to me, and here is this guy who loved sports and playing basketball and wanted to keep playing when others were eating and so on. And he said, well, you'll have to watch out for that guy. He's a troublemaker.
Mm.
And there's the label.
Mhm.
There is systemic racism, and it is just assumed and not even identified. And it is so damaging and so
Mhm.
sad. And there are more examples, but
Sure. Mhm.
anyway, I guess we should go on.
Mhm.
That reminds me of a story I shared on Facebook about there was a group of protesters that were all Black Lives Matter, posted whatever, and then they were all African American, and the police started to come at them, and somebody yelled "White Shield,"
Mm.
and all of these white people came in front of the black people,
Mm.
and then they said that the police were different, that the police were less aggressive, and that they weren't. They stopped being as violent, and when I read that, I was grateful for that. But again, it just broke my heart that this is the way that everything is. That yeah, and it goes way back to the founding of Canada. People think that we live in a Christian nation, that Canada's a Christian nation, and America as well. And people have written books on it, and it's not an Indigenous perspective. It's not a Black perspective. From everything that I've understood, we often say Canada and America are America was built by slaves on stolen Indigenous land. And those are hard things to say, but they're true.
Yes,
When we think of systemic racism, I'm also thinking of the work by Malcolm Gladwell. I guess everyone knows that name, and his book Blink. And he tells about one study, I think it was out of the University of Chicago, and about people who went to buy a car. And in this study, they had a black man dressed up as a young professional with a briefcase, possibly a young lawyer, and a white woman and a white man going to buy a car, simple thing like that. And the black man was quoted a starting price of almost $10,000 higher than that was given to the white man. And it's a longer story, but I'll cut it short. Afterwards, they interviewed the salesperson and said, "Well, you did this," and he said, "Well, was it racism?" "Oh, no racism at all. But I figure that the black man doesn't know the value of cars that well, so I can get a bigger price out of him." There are these kinds of assumptions which at some point seem so benign, like the kid story. It seemed benign. Well, what's the big deal? But over time, it is so debilitating and robs one of one's spirit and hope, even in the world. And that is so very sad.
And there's probably people who have those kinds of thoughts, but would never say that those are racist thoughts, right? But as you say, they have those thoughts lead to consequences for the people who are on the other end of that, right? So for the black man who walks into there to buy the car, he ends up having to pay more. He ends up being insulted, right? So there are consequences to those kinds of thoughts. Whether you call them racist or not, they are actually motivated by race, right? So thank you for highlighting that story. Cheryl, I want to go back to you because you briefly mentioned about police treatment. And this is hard because I think we probably all have friends who are in law enforcement or have relatives in law enforcement. And we love our law enforcement officers. I mean, where would our society be without law enforcement? And I always grew up thinking, police officers are like who I would run to if I had a problem. That's what my parents always say. If you have a problem, you find a police officer, and the police officer will help you. That's what I always grew up thinking. And it's in recent times that, I've started to question that because of things that I've seen. And certainly we don't want to paint all police officers with a wide brush, because that's certainly not the case. But from what we've seen lately, particularly just in this past week around treatment of Indigenous people in various places in Canada, I mean, it's been stunning. It's been almost every day I've been reading a different story from a different province, a different place. But just the treatment of Indigenous people that we've seen, the brutality that we have seen and the way they're treated. I mean, this is something that you've always highlighted to me, Cheryl. It's just the way that Indigenous people are treated within the whole system, right? From policing into the legal system, that whole system, the justice system, seems to be stacked against Indigenous people in Canada. Can you comment on that?
For sure, yes. Yeah, it's really tough to talk about all of these things. As you said about police, I have an Indigenous friend who's a police officer and is working in my community, Natlahwatan First Nation, as a counselor. We meet with the police to talk about things, and we're trying to build a good relationship with the RCMP. And it's kind of like how it is with everything, I guess. Well, with every race relation, it's like 2 steps forward and 3 steps back is how it always kind of feels. And I read something interesting too on Facebook that there's a lot of talk about bad cops, and we can see evidence of police brutality all across the United States. Indigenous people in the US and Canada feel a tremendous solidarity with Black Lives Matter, because we see this happening in our lives as well. And so there's been a lot of Indigenous people who've been there. I even saw jingle dress dancers who were dancing. It's a healing dance, and they were dancing in the spot. There was a big protest going on, and they were dancing on the spot where George Floyd was murdered. And so that kind of solidarity is happening, and in my heart as well. But when we see those police officers doing this stuff and dressed up, of course, in this crazy gear, and somebody wrote, there's good cops and there's bad cops, and then there's complacent cops. And then they said when you see complacent cops, then that makes them bad cops, because they're not speaking out on behalf of the whatever we say, that one rotten apple, right? And I don't think that I hope that most cops are not bad. I hope, but it hasn't really been the experience of Indigenous people to be able to say that, to be able to say, oh, most cops are good, there's a few bad apples, but most of them are good. That hasn't been the Indigenous experience. And unfortunately, when I was growing up, even, and every Native person can say this, when you pass a cop, it's like, get down. If you're in the backseat, you got to get down. You got to kind of hide. And that's what I grew up with my mom. And we were more likely to be pulled over because my mom was very Native, very dark, hair. Of course, all of us a little. My hair just recently went gray, but always had very dark hair. Always easily recognized as Native, and yeah, so those kind of things definitely do happen. In fact, we just had an elder from my community who was leaving our traditional territory and pulling onto the highway, and was pulled over by a police officer who was doing a license check, just making sure she had a driver's license. And I was like, and I wanted to ask the question online, and just do a little bit of a poll and say, have any of my European Canadian, Euro Canadian background people, have you been pulled over to do a license check ever in your life? But yet that's kind of a common thing for Indigenous, and it's like, just pull over, just to have any reason, and it's sort of like, okay, again, once again, there's these two realities. for Indigenous people in Canada and Euro-Canadian people in Canada, and for people of color as well, and for it's I can go into other branches of even Indigenous folks and I mean immigrants and their views of Indigenous people and not being maybe taught properly when they first come to Canada about, do you know that you're entering into a treaty relationship with Indigenous people and not just the country of Canada? So there's that whole aspect as well. But yeah, it's a tough thing to talk about, and it's one of those things where, how do you call the police on the police? Where do you go when you get beat up by the cops? And in Prince George, there's 2 incidences just in the last month, maybe a month and a bit, of 2 Indigenous men who died in custody, and one of them actually was brought to hospital, died later in hospice, but from injuries due to an altercation with the police. And people always jump up and say, well, maybe non-Indigenous people will say, well, you guys shouldn't be resisting arrest. And we're like, these guys weren't resisting arrest. They weren't even actually doing stuff. So and then I have another, I know another story of another young man who was, beat up by the cops and just had put a picture of himself online and just had all these bruises on his face, and just from an altercation with cops. And it was just sort of like, that's life, for us. And it's devastating to have to say that and to be able to talk about it, but and to have and to tell people about it and never have anything done, never see justice. Those things are devastating. So I'm grateful for, I always quote Will Smith. He said, racism isn't getting worse, it's just getting filmed. He said that a few years ago. And I'm grateful for that, because it feels like change is in the air.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of our conversation about racism in Canada. I hope that you found our conversation to be useful as you think through some of these issues that we are facing here together. I hope that you'll join us for part 2 of that conversation. It will be airing next Wednesday at 2:30 on CBM Calling, so please do come back for that. Before we sign off, we want to say hello to some people that are watching today. So I want to say hello to John Campbell from Acadia. Hi, John. Thank you for joining us. And Andrea Tischer from Southwest Community Church. Hi, Andrea. She says that the words covert and deeply ingrained, those are helpful words for us. And Sharon Scott. Hi, Sharon. Always good to make connection with you. I didn't get to see you in person this year, but hopefully next year. And Joseph Prakesh Vera says, hi, watching from India. Hi, Joseph. Thank you for joining us. On Friday for CBM Calling this week, we will be joined by Jordan Weber from Brownfield Baptist Church, and also my former colleague, Gordon King, from Westview Baptist Church in Calgary. We'll be talking about the Coronation Grow Project, the Canadian Food Grains Bank Grow Project. And for those of you who don't know what that is, we will be filling you in on how exciting grow projects are. Especially for those of you who are not living in rural areas, you may never have heard of what these things are. They are wonderful. And so please, I do hope that you will join us on Friday to hear more about growing projects for the Food Grains Bank. Have a good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Bye.